The raven came too late for mercy, and too early for anyone in the crowd to understand what they were witnessing. Tywin Lannister had not ridden south. He did not need to. A lifetime of ruling Casterly Rock had taught him that the swiftest blade was rarely the surest one, and so when word reached him at Harrenhal that his grandson intended to execute Eddard Stark before half the city, he did not argue morality. He argued arithmetic. A letter, sealed in crimson wax and carried by his fastest rider, crossed the distance to King's Landing in under 2 days. An impossible span, save that Tywin had planted riders and fresh horses along the King's Road the moment Robert Baratheon's death reached his ears. He had known, even then, that Cersei's grip on her son was a leash made of wet parchment. He had prepared for this exact failure before it happened. The Sept of Baelor's steps were white marble slicked with the sweat of 10,000 bodies pressed close, straining for a view none of them would forget. Eddard Stark knelt in his black wool, ice's gray ripples catching the pale autumn light as Sir Ilyn Payne raised it. Joffrey Baratheon sat his father's throne. No, sat a wooden mockery of it, hauled up on the Sept steps for the occasion, and lifted his hand in the small, petty gesture that had already doomed 100 men in his short reign. The crowd's roar swelled to meet the blade's descent. It was Pycelle's voice, high and cracking with something that was almost panic, that broke first through the noise. The hand commands a stay of execution. By order of Lord Tywin, hand of the king. The words landed wrong in Joffrey's ears. Not fast enough to stop his hand from falling, but fast enough that Sir Ilyn, who had served 3 kings and understood exactly whose favor kept his own head attached to his shoulders, held the blade a hair's breadth from Ned Stark's neck and did not complete the stroke. It was the smallest mercy imaginable, wrapped in the coldest calculation. Ned would remember the wind of that near miss for the rest of his life, however long that proved to be. Joffrey's face went the color of curdled milk, then a violent, furious red. "I am the king," he said, and his voice cracked on the word king in a way that made several Kingsguard look studiously at the middle distance. "I did not call for a stay." "No, your grace," Pycelle said, bowing so low his chain rattled. "Lord Tywin did. It should have been impossible. A grandfather's word overruling a crowned king's in front of the entire city. The sort of insult that, in any other circumstance, would have ended in someone's death before nightfall." But Tywin Lannister had not survived 4 decades at the center of Westerosi power by making threats he could not back with steel. And every man on those Sept steps who mattered, the Kingsguard captains, the household knights, Janos Slynt commanding the gold cloaks who answered, ultimately, to coin more than crown, understood precisely whose army stood between King's Landing and starvation, and whose gold paid for the very cloaks on their backs. Joffrey might wear the crown. Tywin held the purse strings, and the Lannister host both, and everyone on those steps had learned long ago which of those mattered more. Sansa Stark, chained and wretched in the crowd where they'd forced her to watch, made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a prayer. She did not yet understand what had happened. She only understood that her father's head remained on his shoulders, and for one suspended moment, that was the entire world. Varys watched from a shadowed archway with the particular stillness of a man recalculating every plan he had laid in the last 3 days. The Spider had expected Ned Stark to die that morning. He had, in fact, arranged several contingencies around that certainty. Messages to Dragonstone, whispers meant to reach the north with careful delay, the slow poison of grief that turns lords toward war. All of it now required revision. A living Ned Stark was not a martyr. A living Ned Stark was a piece still on the board, and pieces on the board could be moved, traded, ransomed, or, should the wrong hand seize them, used as a blade against the very people who held them. Littlefinger's expression, by contrast, betrayed nothing at all, which was itself the tell of a man whose plans had just been quietly, catastrophically altered. He had built half his strategy on the assumption of Ned's death and Sansa's consequent total dependence on his protection. A living Ned Stark, however imprisoned, however broken, complicated that dependency in ways Petyr Baelish would need days, not minutes, to properly account for. They dragged Ned back to the black cells beneath the Red Keep before the crowd had fully processed what they'd witnessed. He did not resist. There was nothing left in him to resist with. The confession had already cost him the last of his pride, and Ilyn Payne's blade had cost him whatever hope remained that pride would matter. But some small, stubborn ember in him noted, with the detached clarity of a man who has already accepted his own death and been handed an unexpected reprieve, that reprieves in King's Landing were never free. Tywin Lannister did not deal in mercy. He dealt in leverage, and Ned Stark had just become the single most valuable piece of leverage in the Seven Kingdoms. In the north, 3 days later, a raven found Robb Stark in his war tent outside the Twins, and the words on that small parchment scroll would undo every certainty he had built his campaign upon. His father lived. His father was a prisoner, and somewhere in the fine print of Tywin Lannister's careful, bloodless mercy, there would be a price. There was always a price. And Robb Stark, 17 years old and commanding an army he had raised on the strength of his father's murder, now had to decide what kind of war he was fighting, and for whom. The game had not ended at the Sept of Baelor. It had simply changed hands. The chamber Tywin claimed for himself in the Tower of the Hand had belonged, until a fortnight prior, to Eddard Stark. He did not remark on the irony. He simply had the Stark banners stripped from the walls, the direwolf sigil replaced with nothing at all. An empty space was a cleaner statement than a lion would have been, and settled into the chair as though he had never left it in the first place, decades ago, when he'd served as hand to the Mad King and learned, in blood and fire, exactly what happened when a hand failed to check a king's worst impulses in time. Joffrey summoned him within the hour. It was, Tywin noted, a mistake in itself. A king who summoned his own hand, rather than being received by him, had already conceded something essential about where authority actually lived in this castle. But Joffrey was 13 and freshly crowned, and had not yet learned that the appearance of command mattered less than its substance. So he sat his throne, his actual throne now, black iron and barbed with the swords of the conquered, and glared down at his grandfather with an expression that wanted very badly to be regal and achieved. Instead, something closer to a sulking child denied a sweet. "You countermanded me," Joffrey said, "in front of the whole city. I corrected an error before it became irreversible." Tywin's voice carried no heat. It rarely did. He had found, across a long career of ruling men more volatile than himself, that heat was a luxury afforded to those who did not need to be believed. "Your Grace's father died 3 days prior. You wish to mark your reigns beginning with the death of the North's most powerful lord, displayed before 10,000 witnesses, with his son currently marching an army south. Do you understand what that army does when it learns its lord has been executed rather than ransomed? It comes anyway. They're already at war. They come with purpose rather than desperation. A war fought to win a father's freedom ends in a treaty. A war fought to avenge a father's murder ends only when one side is annihilated, and your Grace's grandfather did not spend 30 years building House Lannister's fortune to see it spent annihilating the North for the sake of your wounded pride." Tywin let that settle, watching Joffrey's face cycle through fury, confusion, and the particular helplessness of a boy who has never once been told no by anyone who could enforce it. Lord Stark lives because a living Lord Stark is worth an army's surrender. A dead one is worth nothing but the war. Your Grace seems so eager to inherit. It was, in its way, the cruelest lesson Tywin had ever taught anyone. Crueler, in its dispassion, than any blade. He was not defending Ned Stark. He would have signed the man's death warrant himself, without a flicker of hesitation, had the timing served House Lannister's interests. He simply understood, in a way Joffrey's 13 years of unchecked indulgence had never permitted him to learn, that mercy and cruelty were not moral categories in the Game of Thrones. They were tools, and a wise player used whichever tool the situation required, discarding sentiment either way. Cersei found her father in his solar an hour later, and where Joffrey had brought fury, she brought something colder and more dangerous. The calculation of a mother watching her son's authority erode in real time, and uncertain whether to shore it up or quietly let it crumble in favor of her own influence. "You made him look weak," she said, without preamble. "In front of the city, in front of the small council, in front of every lord who might have sworn to him out of fear alone." "He is weak," Tywin said. "That was true before I arrived and will remain true regardless of what I do. My task is not to flatter that weakness into strength. My task is to keep the throne he sits upon from being burned out from under him by his own impulses." He regarded his daughter with the particular scrutiny he reserved for pieces whose loyalty he had never fully trusted. "You should be grateful. A dead Stark buys us a war we cannot yet afford to fight, on two fronts, with Stannis and Renly both preparing to make their own claims. A living one buys us time, and time is the only currency more valuable than gold." Cersei's jaw tightened. She did not disagree. She was too intelligent to disagree with the logic, whatever she felt about the method, but agreement did not soften the particular sting of watching her father unmake, with a single sealed letter, the one act of authority her son had managed to claim as entirely his own. And when Robb Stark's army reaches the city walls anyway, when he decides a living hostage isn't worth the wait, then we negotiate. That is what living men are for. Tywin's gaze did not waver. Corpses negotiate nothing. Below the Tower of the Hand, in the black cells carved into the foundations of the Red Keep, Eddard Stark sat in darkness and tried, with the discipline that had carried him through Robert's rebellion and 30 years of hard northern winters, not to hope. Hope, he had learned in the span of a single terrible morning, was more dangerous than despair. Despair asked nothing of a man. Hope asked him to imagine a future. Sansa safe, Arya found, Catelyn's face when he returned to Winterfell. And every one of those imaginings was a blade Tywin Lannister could turn against him the moment it proved useful. A gaoler brought him water and stale bread, and with it, unprompted, a scrap of information delivered in the flat voice of a man following someone else's precise instructions. His daughter Sansa remained in the castle, unharmed, betrothed still to the king who had nearly ordered his death. Ned understood, with the particular clarity that comes to men who have run out of illusions, exactly what this meant. He had not been spared, he had been converted, from a man to be executed into a debt to be collected, with his own children serving as collateral on both ends of the ledger. In the shadowed corridor outside the black cells, Varys lingered longer than his errand required, listening to the silence of a man carefully not weeping. The spider's network of little birds had already begun reporting the city's reaction. Small folk who whispered that the hand had shown mercy, lords who whispered that the hand had shown weakness, and at least 3 noble houses. Varys did not yet know which, though he suspected the Tyrells among them, quietly recalculating whether a Lannister regime capable of such a public reversal was a regime worth continued loyalty. Every reaction was useful. Varys collected them all, the way a man collects kindling before he knows which fire he intends to build. He found Littlefinger in the Godswood an hour before dusk, ostensibly admiring the weirwood tree that Aegon's dragons had spared 300 years prior, though Petyr Baelish had never in his life shown genuine interest in anything he could not monetize. "You look troubled, Lord Varys," Littlefinger said, without turning. "An unusual expression on you." "I am recalculating," Varys admitted, which was as close to honesty as either man permitted himself with the other. "A living Ned Stark changes several arrangements I had considered settled. It changes mine as well." Littlefinger's smile was thin, unbothered, the smile of a man who had already begun sketching the new shape of an old plan. Sansa Stark believed, 3 days ago, that she had no protector left in this city, but a king who ordered her father's death. Now she has a father who lives, imprisoned, and a betrothed who nearly killed him regardless. Grief is a useful leash, Lord Varys. Gratitude, properly cultivated, is a stronger one still. He finally turned, eyes catching the last amber light through the weirwood's blood-red leaves. "Lord Tywin has done me a favor, whether he intended it or not. A girl with a living father to save is a girl who can be made to believe someone is helping her save him." Varys said nothing to that, though the eunuch's placid smile did not reach his eyes. He had long ago stopped being surprised by the depths of Petyr Baelish's opportunism. He had merely never stopped being unsettled by it. 300 leagues north, in a war camp pitched in the shadow of the twins' twin towers, Robb Stark read Tywin Lannister's letter for the 4th time, as though repetition might reveal some hidden clause that made the choice easier. The terms were precise, cold, and utterly without sentiment. Lord Eddard Stark would remain alive and reasonably treated so long as House Stark's armies withdrew from open war and swore, in some form yet to be negotiated, to cease hostilities against the Iron Throne. Continued warfare would be regarded, the letter's language was almost gentle in its brutality, as a forfeiture of the prisoner's value. "He's asking you to surrender," Robb's uncle Edmure Tully said, pacing the length of the tent with the barely contained fury of a man who had already sacrificed men and pride to this war. "Dressed up as mercy. He's asking me to choose," Robb said quietly, "between my father's life and my father's cause. And he knows, he must know, that those were never supposed to be the same choice." He set the letter down on the war table, atop a map already scarred with a dozen marked positions, a dozen calculations of where Lannister gold and Lannister steel might next converge. Greywind, restless at his side, let out a low sound that was not quite a growl. Behind him, unspoken but present in every face around that table, sat the truth none of them wished to name aloud, that Tywin Lannister had not offered mercy at all. He had offered a war within the war, a battle fought not with swords, but with love, obligation, and the unbearable weight of a father's life, balanced against every man who had already died for the Stark cause. It was. Robb understood with a chill that had nothing to do with the northern wind pulling at the tent flaps. Exactly the kind of war his father would have hated most. One where the only way to win was to decide, in cold blood, what a single life was worth against thousands. He did not sleep that night. Somewhere south, in a cell beneath a stolen city, his father did not sleep either. Each of them caught, without ever having chosen it, in the opening moves of Tywin Lannister's longest game. Robb Stark did not answer Tywin's letter for 11 days, and in the silence that followed, the war camp at the Twins became a pressure vessel of divided loyalty that no battle plan had prepared him to command. Lord Rickard Karstark was the first to speak the question every bannerman was thinking, but none dared voice directly to their young king's face. "Your father would tell you to fight," he said, in the war tent, with the bluntness of a man who had already lost kin to Lannister steel and expected to lose more before the war's end. "He would tell you that a Stark does not bend the knee for mercy, dressed in Lannister gold." "My father," Robb said, and his voice carried the particular steadiness of a boy forcing himself to sound like a king, "would tell me that a war fought without weighing its cost is not honor. It's recklessness wearing honor's face." He was not certain, even as he said it, whether he believed his own words or was simply reaching for whatever argument kept his father alive one more day. That uncertainty, more than any single tactical question, was what kept him awake through those 11 nights. The growing suspicion that Tywin Lannister had not merely captured his father's body, but had found a way to hold Robb's own judgment hostage as well. The great John Umber, whose voice could silence a hall by volume alone, put it more simply than either of them. "Kings don't kneel," he said, "but sons save their fathers. The question, Your Grace, is which one you're wearing today." It was Catelyn Stark, arrived from the Eyrie with Sir Roderick and the uneasy peace of the Vale still fragile behind her, who finally broke the deadlock, and she did it with the particular ferocity of a mother who had already lost too much to pretend the calculation was anything but personal. "You will not surrender the war," she told her son, in the privacy of his tent, her voice low and hard as Valyrian steel. "But you will not abandon your father to Tywin Lannister's mercy either, because Tywin Lannister has none, and every day Ned sits in that cell is a day closer to Tywin deciding the hostage has stopped being useful." She had learned, across a lifetime married to a man of unbending principle, precisely where principle needed to yield to survival, and where it could not. There is a third path. There is always a third path, if you're willing to look for it. The path she proposed was audacious enough that even Robb, who had already broken every convention of Westerosi warfare simply by winning battles no one expected a 16-year-old to win, hesitated before agreeing to it. A formal offer, not of surrender, but of negotiated exchange. Jaime Lannister, still held prisoner since the Whispering Wood, traded directly for Eddard Stark, with hostilities to pause, not end, while the terms were settled. It gave Tywin something he could present as victory without requiring Robb to surrender the war his men had already bled for. It was, Catelyn understood with the clear eyes of a woman who had watched Tywin Lannister's mind work from a careful distance for years, exactly the kind of offer a man who valued arithmetic over pride might actually accept. In King's Landing, the offer arrived by Raven 3 days later, and Tywin read it twice in the silence of his solar before setting it down with something almost like satisfaction. Not warmth, Tywin Lannister was incapable of warmth, but the particular pleasure of a man watching an opponent arrive, unprompted, at the exact conclusion he had been maneuvering them toward. A trade. His son for his enemy's father. It cost him nothing. He valued more than the alternative, and it accomplished precisely what he had intended from the moment he'd stayed Ilan Payne's blade. It transformed a war of annihilation into a war of positioning, one where House Lannister's superior resources, superior alliances, and superior patience would eventually grind the North into submission without requiring a single further body on a sept's marble steps. But arithmetic, Tywin would soon be reminded, was never the only force at work in King's Landing. Joffrey, informed of the proposed trade for his uncle, seized upon it with an enthusiasm that had nothing to do with familial loyalty and everything to do with reasserting an authority his grandfather had publicly stripped from him 3 weeks prior. "I'll announce the terms myself," the boy king declared, already composing in his mind the version of events where this had been his mercy, his strategy, his victory, and Tywin, weighing the cost of correcting him publicly a second time against the cost of letting him have this one small harmless vanity, allowed it, filing away the incident as further confirmation that his grandson's reign would require a firmer hand than even he had initially calculated. Cersei, meanwhile, had begun cultivating her own use for the arrangement. She visited the Black Cells herself, an act that surprised the gaoler enough that he nearly forgot to bow, and stood at the bars regarding Eddard Stark with an expression that mixed genuine, weary contempt with something colder and more calculating beneath it. "You'll go home to your northern snows," she told him, "and your daughter stays here, still betrothed to my son, still a hostage in everything but name, whatever pretty word my father chooses to dress it in." It was not cruelty for its own sake. Cersei rarely wasted effort on cruelty that served no purpose, but a deliberate reminder, delivered face to face, that Tywin's clean arithmetic left a remainder that would not resolve so easily. Sansa Stark, who remained in King's Landing regardless of whatever her father's fate became, and who represented a second hostage that no trade agreement had touched. Ned absorbed this without visible reaction, though something in his chest went very still and very cold. He had spent his imprisonment believing, with the particular self-flagellating clarity of Northern honor, that his own life was the only coin being spent in this game. Cersei's visit disabused him of that comfortably narrow view in a single sentence. Sansa herself learned of the proposed trade not from Cersei, nor from Joffrey, but from Petyr Baelish, who found her in the Godswood where she had taken to praying. To the Seven, mostly, though occasionally, in her more desperate moments, to her father's old gods as well, uncertain which of them was listening, but unwilling to risk offending either. "Your father may go home," Littlefinger told her, with the gentle, confiding warmth he had perfected across a lifetime of making young women believe he alone understood them. "But you, sweet girl, remain here. I imagine that frightens you." He did not wait for her answer before continuing, each word placed with the precision of a man laying stones across a river he intended her to cross without ever quite noticing she was being led. "It needn't. I have protected more delicate things than a girl's safety in this city, and I find I've grown rather invested in yours." Sansa, 13 years old and drowning in a court whose rules she had learned too late were nothing like the songs, did not yet understand what kind of debt she was accruing with each kind word Littlefinger offered her. She understood only that her father might live, might go home, and that some small, warm relief in that thought was worth almost any price she did not yet know she was agreeing to pay. The trade itself was arranged for open ground between King's Landing and the Trident, a stretch of contested territory where neither army held clear advantage, and both could claim, afterward, that the meeting had occurred on their terms. Jaime Lannister, thinner than his captivity ought to have made him but no less arrogant for it, rode north under Stark escort with the particular swagger of a man who had never once, in his gilded life, seriously considered that his freedom might not eventually be purchased. Eddard Stark, 3 weeks in a black cell having stripped from him nearly everything but the bare essentials of dignity, rode south under Lannister guard, silent, his eyes fixed on the horizon line where, somewhere beyond it, Winterfell and his remaining children waited. They passed each other at the appointed midpoint, close enough to exchange a single look. Jaime's carrying something almost like respect, grudging and unfamiliar on his face. Ned's carrying nothing at all, the flat exhaustion of a man who had learned, in 3 weeks, more about the true machinery of power than 3 decades of honorable service had ever taught him. Neither man spoke. There was nothing left to say that the exchange itself hadn't already said more eloquently than words could manage. That in the Game of Thrones, even victories arrived with a remainder, and someone, always, was left paying it. Robb Stark received his father at Riverrun 4 days later, and the reunion, witnessed by a war council that had spent 11 anxious days uncertain whether this moment would ever arrive, was quieter than any of them expected. Ned embraced his son without a word, and when he finally spoke, it was not the speech of gratitude or relief the assembled lords had braced themselves for. It was a single, quiet question, delivered in the flat voice of a man already calculating the war's next move. "What have you promised them, in my name?" Robb did not have an easy answer. The trade had bought his father's life, but it had not ended the war. Had, if anything, merely delayed the reckoning both sides knew was still coming, with Sansa still a hostage in King's Landing, with Tywin Lannister's arithmetic still running in the Hand's Tower, and with Stannis Baratheon's fleet, unmentioned in any of Tywin's careful calculations, already gathering off Dragonstone with a claim to the Iron Throne that no trade agreement in the world could resolve. The war had not ended. It had simply, as Robb had feared from the moment he first read Tywin's letter, changed its shape. And somewhere in that new shape, a debt remained unpaid, a daughter remained unprotected, and a Lannister patriarch remained convinced, with the particular confidence of a man who had never yet been proven wrong, that he alone understood the true cost of every life on the board. Cersei Lannister had never considered herself a patient woman, but 3 weeks of watching her father reshape King's Landing according to his own private arithmetic had taught her a grudging appreciation for patience's uses, chiefly that it allowed her to observe exactly where Tywin's calculations left gaps, and to begin, quietly, filling them with her own designs. The gap she'd identified was simple enough. Her father had traded away Jaime, her Jaime, her twin, the other half of herself, in every way that mattered, for an aging Northern Lord's freedom, and had done so without once consulting her, as though her own feelings on the matter were beneath the consideration of his ledgers. She understood the logic. She even, in the coldest part of her mind, agreed with it. But understanding and agreement had never been the same as forgiveness, and Cersei Lannister did not forgive easily, least of all her father. "You gave him away," she said, when she finally cornered Tywin in his solar, her voice carrying none of the practiced composure she wore in the throne room. "My brother, for a man who would have seen us all executed, given half the chance. I gave away a prisoner to secure a prisoner's release, and in doing so purchased a pause in a war we are not presently equipped to win outright." Tywin did not look up from the ledger before him. Small council accounts, grain requisitions, the endless, bloodless machinery of holding a kingdom together while it bled from a dozen directions at once. "Your brother will return to us whole and unharmed, which is more than I can say for the alternative, had Robb Stark's army continued its advance unchecked, while Stannis and Renly circled like carrion birds waiting for us to weaken further." He set down his quill. "Sentiment is a luxury, Cersei. I have never had the freedom to indulge it, and neither, I remind you, do you." It was, Cersei reflected, as she left the solar with her fury banked but not extinguished, precisely the kind of answer her father always gave, unimpeachable in its logic, and utterly indifferent to the fact that logic was not the only currency that mattered. In a family already fracturing under the weight of a crown, none of them had wanted quite this way. She turned her attention, in the days that followed, to the one piece of leverage her father's careful trade had left conspicuously untouched: Sansa Stark. If Tywin intended to play a long game of hostages and calculated mercy, Cersei intended to ensure that whatever game emerged from it did not leave House Lannister's Queen Regent without cards of her own to play. She began, subtly, cultivating the girl, small kindnesses, careful conversations, the particular attentiveness of a woman who understood better than anyone in that castle how quickly a girl's gratitude could be converted into loyalty, and how useful loyalty became when a war's outcome remained genuinely uncertain. Littlefinger noticed, of course. Littlefinger noticed everything that touched Sansa Stark, having invested considerably more than casual interest in ensuring he remained her primary confidant in a court that offered her few enough of those. He raised the matter with Varys in the kind of oblique conversation the two men had perfected over years of mutual, wary cooperation. "The Queen Regent has taken an interest in our little bird," he said, watching a raven wheel above the Red Keep's towers with studied casualness. "I find myself wondering whether that interest is maternal or merely acquisitive. With Cersei Lannister," Varys said, "I have rarely found those categories to be mutually exclusive." He paused, weighing how much to share with a man he trusted, precisely as far as their interests aligned, and not 1 inch further. Lord Tywin's trade bought the realm a pause. It did not buy it peace. Stannis Baratheon's fleet grows by the week, and Lord Tywin's arithmetic, for all its precision, has not yet found a column in which to properly account for a man who believes himself the gods' chosen instrument. That, both men understood without needing to say it aloud, was the flaw in Tywin Lannister's otherwise flawless calculation, the assumption that every actor in this war could be reduced to interests and leverage, when Stannis Baratheon operated according to a different arithmetic entirely, one where legitimacy and destiny mattered more than gold, and where a red priestess whispered promises no ledger could properly price. Word of Stannis's growing fleet reached the small council 3 days later, delivered by a breathless rider whose horse had been ridden nearly to death, covering the distance from Storm's End. Tywin absorbed the report with his customary stillness, though those who knew him well enough to read the small signs, the particular set of his jaw, the fractional pause before he spoke, understood that this news troubled him more than he intended to show. "Lord Stannis has always believed the throne his by right," Grand Maester Pycelle offered, in the wheedling, unhelpful tone he reserved for stating obvious things at unhelpful length. "His claim, of course, is entirely without merit, given Joffrey's legitimate Lord Stannis's claims. Merit is irrelevant to how many ships he commands," Tywin cut in, with the particular impatience he reserved for Pycelle specifically. He turned to Varys. "What do your little birds say of Dragonstone?" "That the Lady Melisandre has grown considerably more influential than a mere red priestess ought to be," Varys said, choosing his words with care. "That Lord Stannis burns wooden idols of the Seven upon her council, and speaks, increasingly, of a Lord of Light who has chosen him for a purpose greater than any throne." He let that settle before adding, with the faint, unreadable smile he wore when delivering information he suspected would prove unwelcome. "Faith, my lords, does not respond to the same incentives as fear or greed. It is considerably harder to negotiate with a man who believes he cannot lose." Tywin's expression did not change, but something in the room's temperature seemed to drop regardless. He had spent his career mastering the machinery of Westerosi power, armies, gold, marriages, the careful application of fear in precisely calibrated doses, and every tool in that arsenal depended on the underlying assumption that his opponents, however proud or foolish, remained fundamentally rational actors weighing costs against benefits. A man convinced of his own divine purpose did not weigh costs the same way. That, more than Robb Stark's army or Renly's numbers, or even the still unresolved matter of Ned Stark's continued survival, represented the genuine unknown variable in Tywin's otherwise meticulously calculated war. In the north, the trade's aftermath had settled into an uneasy quiet that satisfied no one entirely. Ned Stark, recovering slowly at River Run under Catelyn's watchful care, found himself in the strange position of a man restored to freedom, but stripped of the certainty that had once defined him. He had ridden south believing in the plain, unbending logic of honor and law. He had returned having learned, in the space of 3 brutal weeks, that Tywin Lannister's cold arithmetic had accomplished what neither honor nor law alone could have managed. It had kept him alive, and in keeping him alive, had bought House Lannister time it might otherwise never have secured. "I owe him nothing," Ned told Catelyn, when she found him standing before the Godswood's ancient heart tree, his voice carrying the particular rawness of a man still working through what his captivity had cost him, beyond the merely physical. "And yet I cannot pretend the alternative would have served our children better." "You survived," Catelyn said simply. "That is not a debt, Ned. That is simply what is." But even as she said it, both of them understood the deeper, more uncomfortable truth sitting beneath the relief of his return. That Sansa remained in King's Landing, a hostage in fact if not in name, and that whatever gratitude Ned Stark refused to feel toward Tywin Lannister, his daughter's continued safety depended entirely on the same cold, patient calculation that had spared her father's life. The war was not over. It had simply moved its most vulnerable piece to a board Ned Stark could no longer see, let alone protect. Robb, watching his father's slow recovery from across the yard at River Run, found himself troubled by a question that had no comfortable answer. If Tywin Lannister's mercy had been genuine strategy, rather than sentiment, then everything that followed, the trade, the pause in fighting, even his father's survival, existed only so long as it continued serving Lannister interests. The moment that calculation shifted, so too would Tywin's patience, and Robb had no illusions about how quickly a Lannister's patience could curdle into something considerably less merciful once it stopped paying dividends. He called his bannermen together that evening, not to announce a resumption of hostilities, but to make clear, in terms even the Great John's blunt sensibilities could appreciate, that the war's pause was a tactic, not a surrender. "We rest," Robb told them. "We resupply, and we watch Stannis Baratheon's fleet with considerably more interest than we watch King's Landing's gates. Because whatever happens next in this war, it will not be Tywin Lannister alone who decides it." Outside the tent, beneath a sky thick with the particular cold clarity of a riverland's autumn, Grey Wind lifted his head toward the south, ears pricked, as though some distant disturbance had reached him before it reached any of the men still arguing strategy within. Something was shifting in the war's balance. Not the balance Tywin had so carefully engineered at the Sept of Baelor, but something larger, and considerably less containable, gathering itself in the waters off Dragonstone. The price of Sansa Stark's continued residence in King's Landing revealed itself slowly, in increments too small for any single one to seem worth resisting, which was, Sansa would come to understand only much later, precisely how prices were meant to be extracted in this city. It began with small accommodations. Cersei, cultivating the girl with the patient attentiveness of a woman building toward some future use not yet fully declared, arranged for Sansa to be moved from the cramped chamber she'd occupied since her father's arrest into rooms considerably closer to the royal apartments, an improvement in comfort that came wrapped, inevitably, in closer proximity to Joffrey, whose moods remained as unpredictable as they had been before his grandfather's intervention, and whose resentment at being publicly overruled had curdled, in the weeks since, into something quieter and more dangerous than his earlier outbursts. He no longer raged. He watched, instead, with the particular patience of a boy who had learned that his grandfather controlled the visible levers of power and was determined to find levers of his own that Tywin's arithmetic hadn't yet accounted for. Sansa learned to read the shifts in his temperament the way sailors learned to read weather, and it was this education, brutal, constant, conducted without a single lesson she would have chosen for herself, that Littlefinger observed with the particular satisfaction of a man watching an investment mature ahead of schedule. He found her in the Godswood again, 3 weeks after the trade that had freed her father, and this time his conversation carried less patience than warmth. "Your father is safely returned to River Run," he said, without preamble. "You must be relieved." "I am grateful to Lord Tywin," Sansa said, the careful, courtly phrase she had learned to produce automatically now, regardless of what she actually felt beneath it. She had grown skilled, in her captivity, at the particular art of saying nothing true while appearing to say everything expected. Grateful. Littlefinger turned the word over as though tasting it, and something in his expression suggested he found it wanting. "Lord Tywin traded you for nothing, sweet girl. Your father, yes. Your father he traded for his own son's freedom, a transaction with clear value on both sides. But you remain here regardless, and no one has yet explained to me what Lord Tywin intends to trade for your freedom, when the time comes that trading you becomes convenient rather than costly." He let that sit, watching her absorb it, before continuing in the softer register he reserved specifically for moments like this one. "I find myself wondering who, in this whole city, actually intends to secure your safety when the arithmetic shifts. Because it will shift, Sansa. Everything in King's Landing shifts, eventually, and I would rather you understood that now, from someone who has your genuine welfare in mind, than learn it later from someone who does not." It was, Sansa would only recognize years afterward, one of the most skillfully constructed manipulations she would ever be subjected to, true in every particular, and devastating precisely because of that truth, wrapped around a kindness calculated to the last careful degree. Varys, observing this particular courtship from his network of little birds scattered through the godswood's hedges, found himself troubled by a calculation of his own. He had spent the weeks since Ned Stark's trade quietly reassessing every assumption he'd built his strategy upon, and the reassessment kept returning to the same uncomfortable conclusion: that Tywin Lannister's cold mercy, however effective in the immediate term, had created a vacuum around Sansa Stark's continued welfare that Petyr Baelish was filling with considerably more purpose than anyone in the Red Keep seemed to have noticed. He raised the matter obliquely in his next audience with Tywin, a conversation conducted, as all their conversations were, in the careful language of implication rather than direct accusation, since direct accusation was a currency Varys spent as rarely as possible. "Lord Baelish has taken a particular interest in the Stark girl's welfare," he offered, watching Tywin's face for the flicker of attention he was fishing for. "I wonder whether that interest serves the crown's purposes or merely his own." "Everything Petyr Baelish does serves his own purposes," Tywin said, without looking up from the reports before him. "The question that matters is whether his purposes presently align with mine. At this moment they do. He wishes the girl protected and pliable, and so do I, for reasons that have nothing to do with sentiment on either side." He finally looked up, and something in his gaze suggested he had, in fact, considered this precise question at greater length than his dismissive tone implied. "The day his interests diverge from the crown's, Lord Varys, you will inform me. Until then, I have a war to manage that requires considerably more urgent attention than one lord's fondness for a 13-year-old girl." The war in question had, in the weeks since Ned Stark's release, acquired a shape considerably more alarming than the one Tywin had originally calculated for. Stannis Baratheon's fleet, gathered off Dragonstone under the red banners of R'hllor, as much as the Black Stag of House Baratheon, had grown from a rumor into a confirmed and substantial threat. One that Renly Baratheon's own considerable army, encamped in the Reach with Tyrell's support behind it, complicated further by refusing to resolve itself into a single, predictable enemy. Two Baratheon brothers, each convinced of his own legitimate claim, each backed by forces Tywin could not simply outcalculate the way he had outcalculated a single Northern Lord's execution. It was Tyrion, freshly arrived from the Vale by a circuitous and dangerous route, who first laid the full shape of the problem before his father, in terms even Tywin's careful composure struggled to receive without visible strain. "You've secured a pause with the North," Tyrion said, settling into the chair across from his father's desk, with the particular insouciance he deployed specifically to unsettle people who preferred him cowed. "Which is, I'll grant you, more than I expected, given how that execution nearly went. But a pause with Robb Stark buys us nothing against two Baratheon claimants converging on this city, with combined forces that, should they somehow align rather than destroy each other first, would make King's Landing's walls considerably less reassuring than they presently feel." "They will not align," Tywin said. "Brothers who each believe themselves the rightful king do not share thrones." "No," Tyrion agreed, "but they might share a battlefield, if one arrives before the other and forces the timing." He leaned forward, and for a moment the family resemblance between father and son, so often obscured by Tywin's contempt and Tyrion's practiced deflection of it, became briefly, unmistakably visible in the shared sharpness of their attention. "You bought us time with the Starks, father. I would suggest we spend that time considerably more urgently than we presently are, because Stannis Baratheon's fleet does not care about your arithmetic, and Melisandre's flames, from what my little birds tell me, promise him victories that owe nothing to gold or leverage at all." Tywin's silence, in the moment that followed, carried more weight than any response he might have given aloud. He had built his entire strategy around the assumption that every player in this war could eventually be reduced to interests, incentives, and the patient application of pressure. Ned Stark's life, traded for Jaime's freedom, had proven that assumption correct in one theater of the war. But Stannis Baratheon, burning idols and speaking of prophecy, with the absolute conviction of a man who believed the Lord of Light himself had chosen his cause, represented something Tywin's ledgers had no column for. And somewhere beneath his composed exterior, the Lord of Casterly Rock permitted himself, for perhaps the first time since he'd sent that raven to stay Ilan Payne's blade, a genuine flicker of uncertainty about whether cold arithmetic alone would be sufficient to see House Lannister through what was coming. Outside, beyond the city's walls, the waters of Blackwater Bay remained calm under an autumn sky, deceptively calm, the particular stillness that precedes a storm large enough to reshape everything it touches. Somewhere within that stillness, a red priestess watched flames only she could properly interpret, and saw in them a victory that would arrive, when it came, with a color no one in King's Landing had yet learned to fear. The green light came first as rumor, then as a smell carried on the wind off Blackwater Bay, something acrid and wrong, chemical in a way that no honest fire should be. And by the time Tywin Lannister understood the full shape of what Stannis Baratheon's fleet intended, the war he had spent 2 months carefully calibrating through hostages and cold arithmetic had arrived, without asking his permission, at the gates of the city he was sworn to defend. He had ridden hard from Harrenhal the moment word reached him that Stannis' fleet had abandoned Dragonstone in earnest, force-marching his host through the Riverlands with a speed that left half his baggage train scattered behind him, arriving at King's Landing's walls with hours, not days, to spare. It was, he reflected grimly, as he took stock of the city's defenses, precisely the kind of margin that ought never to have been necessary, a margin that existed only because 2 months of his attention had been consumed managing a Northern Lord's survival and a Northern Lord's son's suspicions, while the more immediate threat gathered strength off the coast unchallenged. Tyrion, appointed acting hand, in his father's absence, and left holding a city he privately suspected his father expected to lose, had not been idle in those 2 months, whatever else history might say of him. Wildfire, alchemists, chain links forged in secret beneath the Iron Bank's disapproving nose. All of it assembled with the particular ingenuity of a man who understood that cleverness was the only currency he possessed that his father could not simply overrule. When Stannis' fleet finally entered the Blackwater in its full, terrible strength, it sailed into a trap 2 months in the making, and the green fire that followed turned the bay into something out of a Septon's vision of the Seven Hells, ships and men alike, consumed in flame that water could not extinguish. Tywin's arrival on the field, at the precise moment the battle's outcome still hung genuinely undecided, would be remembered by those who survived it as the turning stroke. Lannister and Tyrell banners together, Renly's death at his brother's hand, having driven half the Reach's strength into an alliance with the very house it had marched south to destroy, crashing into Stannis' remaining forces from the rear, while the city's defenders held the gates. By nightfall, Stannis Baratheon's grand fleet was ash, and wreckage scattered across the Blackwater. His army broken, his own person fled back to Dragonstone with what remained of his conviction that the Lord of Light had promised him this crown. It should have been, by every measure Tywin understood, an unambiguous triumph, the kind of decisive victory that reshaped a war's entire trajectory in a single evening. And in the immediate aftermath, it was received as exactly that. King's Landing's small folk, who had spent the battle's duration cowering in cellars and septs, emerged to find their city not merely saved, but saved so thoroughly that Stannis' threat had been effectively annihilated as a military force for the foreseeable future. Joffrey, who had spent the battle hiding in the throne room under the flimsy pretense of commanding reserves, nonetheless found himself credited by the small folk's grateful, inaccurate gossip with a valor he had not remotely displayed, and Tywin, arriving at the head of the relieving force, allowed the boy that fiction, with the same cold calculation he applied to every question of what truths were useful to permit and which were better left uncorrected. But victories Tywin had learned across a long career always arrived with a remainder, and this one's remainder proved considerably larger than he had anticipated. The first complication announced itself within the tower where Sansa Stark had spent the battle, along with the other highborn women, under Cersei's supervision, and no small measure of the Queen Regent's own barely restrained terror. In the hours of chaos that followed the wildfire's ignition, chaos that had, for one dangerous stretch, seen the castle's own defenses stretched thin enough that mob violence had reached the Red Keep's outer yards, Sansa had very nearly been lost amid a crowd of panicking goldcloaks and fleeing servants, saved only by the intervention of a man she had not expected to find protecting her at all. Sandor Clegane, the Hound, who had abandoned his post at Joffrey's side mid-battle in a fit of disgust, at the boy king's cowardice, and who had, in the confused hours that followed, found himself standing between Sansa Stark and a mob that would have torn her apart for the crime of being visibly, vulnerably highborn in a city that had briefly forgotten its own laws. It was a debt Sansa had not asked for and did not fully understand how to repay, and it complicated, in ways Littlefinger had not anticipated when he'd spent 2 months carefully cultivating his own claim on her gratitude, the delicate architecture of protection and obligation he had been constructing around her. He noted the development with the particular displeasure of a man watching an unplanned variable enter a calculation he had believed fully controlled, and began, within days, adjusting his approach accordingly. The second complication arrived in the form of a raven from Riverrun 3 days after the battle's smoke had cleared, carrying news that reshaped the war's political calculus as thoroughly as the Blackwater's fire had reshaped its military one. Robb Stark, informed of Stannis's catastrophic defeat and the resulting collapse of the only credible check on Lannister-Tyrell dominance in the South, understood with the clear-eyed pragmatism his father had never quite possessed that the North's negotiating position, already weakened by the trade that had freed Ned Stark at the cost of ending open Stark aggression, had just deteriorated further, and considerably faster than he'd anticipated. With Stannis broken and Renly dead, House Lannister no longer needed to fear a two-front war against Baratheon claimants. It needed only to finish the North at its leisure, whenever that leisure proved convenient. Tywin Lannister will not offer us another trade, Robb told his council, the Raven's message still in his hand. He offered the last one because he needed the pause more than we did. He does not need it any longer. It was Catelyn, watching her son absorb the full weight of that realization, who gave voice to the question underlying every strategic recalculation the war room had spent the evening working through. Then what does he need instead? The answer, delivered by Raven to Riverrun a fortnight later, arrived not from Tywin directly, but through the careful diplomatic channels Varys maintained, specifically for messages too delicate to commit fully to Tywin's own seal, an offer, gently but unmistakably framed, of marriage. Sansa Stark, still nominally betrothed to Joffrey, could be quietly released from that engagement, a mercy Tywin was prepared to extend, given how thoroughly Joffrey's conduct during the battle had complicated the boy's usefulness as a symbol of Lannister strength, in exchange for a different alliance entirely. Sansa wed instead to a Lannister of Tywin's choosing, binding North and Rock together through blood rather than mere hostage-taking, and in doing so, ending the war not through conquest, but through the oldest currency Westeros possessed. Ned Stark, reading the proposal at Riverrun with his son beside him, felt something in his chest go very still, not the cold stillness of the black cells, but something closer to grief for a version of his family's future he had never imagined having to consider. He wants to finish what he started at the Sept of Baelor, Ned said quietly. He didn't spare my life out of mercy. He spared it so that my daughter would still be alive to marry into his house, and my house would be too grateful, or too exhausted, to refuse him. Robb said nothing for a long moment, his hand resting on the map table where 2 months of war had been marked and remarked in a dozen shifting configurations. Somewhere in King's Landing, his sister waited, protected now by a debt owed to a disgraced knight rather than the careful architecture Littlefinger had built around her. And somewhere in the Hand's Tower, Tywin Lannister waited for an answer to a proposal that would either end the War of the Five Kings on Lannister terms, or reveal, finally, the true limit of how far his cold arithmetic could be stretched before it broke against something it could not calculate at all: a father's fury and a son's unwillingness to trade his sister's future for a peace built on someone else's terms. Robb Stark's answer, when it came, was not the answer Tywin Lannister had calculated for. It arrived not as acceptance nor outright refusal, but as something considerably more dangerous to the delicate architecture Tywin had spent 2 months constructing. Silence, followed 3 weeks later by word that House Stark's remaining bannermen had begun fortifying positions throughout the Riverlands, and that Robb had ridden not toward King's Landing to negotiate, but toward the Crag and Ashemark, striking at outlying Lannister holdings with the same tactical brilliance that had won him every battle of the war thus far. It was not the resumption of full hostilities Tywin had feared most. Robb had not marched on the capital, had not repudiated the earlier trade that kept his father alive. But it was, unmistakably, a message, delivered in the only language Tywin Lannister had ever truly respected: force, applied precisely where it would be felt. "He refuses the marriage," Tywin said, reading the reports of burned granaries and captured outriders with the particular stillness that those who knew him best had learned to fear more than any outburst. "But he does not resume the war outright. He is telling me something." "He's telling you," Tyrion offered, from the chair he had claimed across his father's desk, with the ease of a man who had earned, through the Blackwater's defense, a measure of standing he intended to spend freely, "that he understood exactly what you were asking for, and found it insulting enough to answer with fire rather than a raven. You proposed trading his sister like breeding stock to settle a war, father. Did you expect gratitude? I expected pragmatism. The North cannot sustain this war indefinitely, whatever their early victories suggested, and a marriage costs considerably less blood than a continued campaign. You expected pragmatism from a boy whose father you imprisoned, whose father's execution you personally halted, only to leverage his survival into 2 months of political maneuvering, and whose sister remains, functionally, a hostage in this very castle, regardless of what fiction we dress that arrangement in." Tyrion's voice carried none of his usual deflective wit. This, evidently, was a subject he had considered with more care than his customary irreverence suggested. "You've spent this entire war treating the Starks as a problem to be solved through leverage, father, and it has worked, remarkably, for longer than I would have credited. But leverage has limits, and I suspect Robb Stark has just shown you where his begins." Tywin did not respond directly to this, though something in his expression suggested the observation had landed with more weight than he cared to acknowledge aloud. He had, in the 2 months since staying ill in Payne's Blade, come to view his own strategy as something close to unimpeachable, a demonstration of exactly the kind of cold, patient statecraft that separated men who ruled from men who merely reigned. Robb Stark's refusal, delivered through burned granaries rather than diplomatic language, represented the first genuine crack in that self-assurance since the war's beginning. In King's Landing, the marriage proposal's failure produced consequences considerably closer to home than the burning granaries of the Western Riverlands. Sansa Stark learned of her brother's refusal not through any official channel, but through Littlefinger, who delivered the news with the particular gentleness he reserved for information calculated to increase her dependence on him specifically. "Your brother has refused Lord Tywin's offer," he told her, in the covered walk above the throne room, where they had taken to speaking with increasing regularity since the Battle of the Blackwater. "You remain, for the moment, unbetrothed and unprotected by any formal arrangement, which I confess troubles me considerably, given how precarious your position in this city has already proven itself to be." "What would you have me do, Lord Baelish?" Sansa asked, and something in her voice, a hardness that had not been present in her first weeks of captivity, forged slowly across 2 months of watching every kindness in King's Landing arrive with a hidden cost, suggested she had learned, at least partially, to recognize the shape of what was being offered before it was fully spoken. "Trust," Littlefinger said, "is a scarce resource in this city, sweet girl. I would simply ask that you remember who has offered you theirs freely, and who has offered you only calculation." He did not press further, understanding, with the patience of a man who had built an entire career on the slow cultivation of leverage, that pressing too hard too soon would undo months of careful work. But the seed was planted, and Sansa, walking back to her chambers through corridors that had taught her more about the true machinery of power than any Septa's lessons ever had, found herself weighing his words against the memory of Sandor Clegane's rough, unasked-for protection during the Blackwater's chaos, and against the cold, unmistakable fact that her own father's captivity, however resolved, had never once been about mercy at all. The Hound himself, summoned before the small council to answer for his abandonment of Joffrey's side mid-battle, found Tywin considerably less inclined toward punishment than the Boy King had demanded. "You left your post," Tywin said, regarding Clegane with the flat, assessing look he applied to every asset whose usefulness required recalculation, "and in doing so, preserved the life of a hostage whose continued survival serves House Lannister's interests more than your presence at a coward king's side ever could have." It was, in its way, the closest thing to approval Tywin Lannister was capable of expressing, wrapped entirely in the language of utility rather than gratitude. You will remain assigned to Lady Sansa's protection, formally this time, rather than by accident. It was a decision that satisfied no one entirely. Joffrey, furious at being denied his preferred punishment for what he considered outright betrayal. Cersei, uneasy at how thoroughly her father continued rearranging the board around Sansa Stark, without consulting her. Littlefinger, whose careful cultivation now found itself competing directly with a formally sanctioned rival for the girl's trust. But it was, Tywin calculated, the arrangement most likely to keep his most valuable remaining hostage both safe and grateful, two conditions he had learned, across 2 months of Stark-related complications, were not nearly as easily secured together as his early confidence had assumed. Word of the Riverlands raids reached Casterly Rock's western holdings with predictable speed, and it was there, among burned granaries and the particular fury of lesser Lannister cousins who had never fully trusted Tywin's strategy of mercy toward the north, that the first genuine dissent within House Lannister's own ranks began to surface. Sir Kevan Lannister, Tywin's brother and the closest thing to a genuine confidant the man permitted himself, raised the matter directly, in the privacy Tywin extended to almost no one else. "There are those among our own bannermen," Kevan said, "who believe you softened when the Stark boy's father should have died at the Sept, and who see these raids as proof they were right to doubt your judgment." "Let them doubt," Tywin said. "Doubt is a luxury afforded to men who do not bear the consequences of decisions. I bear those consequences. I will continue bearing them, regardless of what lesser cousins whisper in Lannisport's taverns." But even as he said it, alone that evening in the Tower of the Hand, with reports of burned granaries and a refused marriage spread across his desk, Tywin Lannister permitted himself a rare, private accounting of a war that had not unfolded according to the clean arithmetic he had calculated at the Sept of Baelor's steps 2 months prior. He had spared Ned Stark's life to prevent a war of annihilation, and had, in doing so, purchased a pause rather than a peace. A pause that Stannis' destruction had briefly seemed to render irrelevant, and that Robb Stark's burned granaries had just proven very much still in effect, on terms Tywin no longer fully controlled. Somewhere beyond his tower's windows, the city he had saved from wildfire and Baratheon ambition slept uneasily, unaware that the war determining its future had entered a phase considerably more unpredictable than the cold, patient calculations that had thus far kept it from outright catastrophe. A phase where a son's fury, a daughter's divided loyalties, and a Lord of Casterly Rock's first genuine miscalculation would together determine whether House Lannister's careful mercy had bought House Stark's submission or merely delayed, by 2 costly months, a reckoning neither house could any longer avoid. The message that finally broke the standoff between River Run and King's Landing did not come from Robb Stark at all, but from a source neither side had accounted for in their careful calculations of leverage and consequence. Walder Frey, whose bridge and castle sat astride the only crossing that had allowed Robb's army to reach the Riverlands in the first place, and whose patience for a war that had yet to properly reward his house's loyalty, had, after 2 months of watching younger, grander lords receive all the war's glory and none of its debts, finally curdled into something considerably more transactional than loyalty. The letter Frey sent to Casterly Rock arrived sealed with wax the color of dried blood, and carried an offer whose audacity even Tywin, a man rarely surprised by the depths of other lords' opportunism, found himself briefly taken aback by. Safe passage for a Lannister force through the Twins, unopposed and unannounced, in exchange for concessions to House Frey's standing that no amount of Robb Stark's gratitude had thus far provided. It was, Tywin recognized immediately, an act of betrayal dressed in the careful language of renegotiated loyalty, and it was also, he understood with the particular clarity of a man who had spent 2 months discovering the limits of mercy as a strategy, exactly the kind of opportunity his earlier restraint had been designed to preserve the option of using. "You would break the peace you yourself negotiated," Tyrion said, when his father laid the proposal before the small council, with the flat, unemotional tone he reserved for decisions he had already made and expected no genuine debate over. "The trade that freed Ned Stark, the pause that is held, however uneasily, for 2 months. The pause held because it served both sides' interests," Tywin said. Robb Stark's raids on our Western holdings suggest he no longer believes it serves his. I am simply recognizing the same shift in calculation he has already made and acting on it before he can press whatever advantage he believes those raids have purchased him. It was, Cersei noted privately, the first time in the entire war that her father had proposed an action that could not be dressed in the language of mercy or restraint, a naked stroke of opportunism, betrayal purchased with Frey gold and Frey resentment, aimed at ending the war through the one method Tywin had spent 2 months carefully avoiding: overwhelming, decisive violence, delivered without warning against an enemy who still, however tenuously, believed a negotiated peace remained possible. The scale of what Frey proposed became clear only once Tywin's own intelligence, gathered through Varys's careful network, confirmed the full shape of the opportunity. Robb Stark's core host, weakened by the Western raids and stretched thin defending gains across 2 fronts, would be vulnerable, briefly and catastrophically, if a Lannister force could cross the Twins unopposed and strike before Robb's scattered bannermen could regroup. It was the kind of decisive stroke that could end the war in a single engagement, and it required, Tywin understood with the cold clarity that had guided every decision since the Sept of Baelor, a willingness to abandon the careful, patient arithmetic that had defined his strategy thus far in favor of something considerably more final. Varys, informed of the Frey proposal through his own channels before Tywin formally raised it with the council, found himself facing a decision that tested the limits of his careful neutrality more severely than anything since the war's beginning. He had spent 2 months quietly reassessing every calculation he'd made about Tywin Lannister's strategy and had concluded, with something approaching genuine respect, that the man's cold mercy toward Ned Stark had represented a legitimate attempt to avoid exactly the kind of annihilating violence Frey's offer now made possible. That Tywin appeared ready to abandon that restraint, the moment his own interests shifted, troubled Varys, in ways he found himself unable to fully suppress, whatever his professed loyalty to whichever throne currently occupied the Red Keep. "You would use Frey's betrayal to destroy the very peace your own mercy purchased," Varys said. In the private audience he requested specifically to raise the objection Tywin had not solicited. "I confess, my lord, I find myself uncertain what lesson future kings are meant to draw from a strategy that begins in restraint and ends in exactly the violence that restraint was meant to prevent." "The lesson," Tywin said, "is that restraint serves a purpose only so long as it produces results superior to its alternative. Robb Stark's raids demonstrate that my restraint no longer produces those results. I am not obligated to remain merciful past the point mercy stops working. Lord Varys, whatever poetic lesson you would prefer future kings draw from my conduct." It was an answer that satisfied the strict logic of Tywin's own arithmetic completely, and satisfied almost nothing else. Not Varys's carefully cultivated sense of the realm's stability, not Tyrion's growing unease at watching his father's calculated mercy reveal itself as merely another form of calculated cruelty deferred. And not, though neither man said it aloud in the small council chamber, Cersei's own complicated relationship with a father whose ruthlessness she had spent her entire life both fearing and, in her darker moments, wishing she could match. News of the Frey betrayal reached Riverrun 3 days before the Lannister force intended to exploit it, carried not by any formal channel but by Sir Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, whose own network of scouts and old loyalties had caught wind of unusual troop movements near the Twins that no honest explanation could account for. Robb Stark, presented with evidence that his own bridge across the Trident had been quietly sold to the enemy, felt something in his understanding of the war shift, with the particular finality of a man discovering that the ground he had been standing on had never been as solid as he'd believed. "Tywin Lannister spared my father's life," Robb said, in the War Council convened within hours of the Blackfish's warning, "and I have spent 2 months trying to honor whatever peace that mercy was meant to purchase. I see now what I should have understood from the beginning, that the mercy was never for my father's sake, or mine, or House Stark's. It was arithmetic, and arithmetic changes the moment new numbers enter the calculation." Catelyn, watching her son absorb this lesson, with the particular grief of a mother who had hoped he might be spared learning it so young, offered the only counsel she had left to give. "Then you must change your own numbers first," she said, "before his do." What followed was not the battle Tywin had calculated for. Robb Stark, warned of the Frey betrayal with days rather than hours to prepare, abandoned the Western campaign entirely, and force-marched his core host back toward the Twins with a speed that matched, and in places exceeded, the urgency Tywin himself had shown riding to King's Landing's defense during the Blackwater crisis. When the Lannister force crossing the Twins finally engaged what they expected to be a scattered, vulnerable enemy, they found instead a Stark army arrayed in full battle order, forewarned and furious, fighting not merely for territory, but for the bitter, personal knowledge that the peace they'd been asked to honor had been a fiction from its very inception. The battle that followed was neither the decisive Lannister victory Frey's betrayal had promised, nor the annihilating defeat it might have produced against an unprepared enemy. It was, instead, something considerably messier and more costly to both sides, a bloody, inconclusive engagement that cost Tywin several hundred men and any remaining pretense that his mercy toward Ned Stark had been anything other than tactical, and cost Robb Stark the last of his willingness to consider any peace that did not include Tywin Lannister's head, or at minimum, his unconditional surrender of every advantage the trade had originally purchased. In its aftermath, Walder Frey found himself in the uncomfortable position of a man who had bet on the wrong outcome without fully committing to either side, his bridge held but his loyalty exposed to both houses simultaneously, trusted now by neither. Tywin, surveying the battle's costly, indecisive result from his tent near the Trident, understood with the particular clarity of a man confronting his first genuine strategic failure since the war began, that his mercy toward Ned Stark, whatever its original wisdom, had purchased 2 months of pause at a price he was only now beginning to fully calculate. A Stark heir who no longer believed any Lannister promise, however carefully constructed, and a war that had just become, in the span of a single costly battle, considerably harder to end than it had ever been to begin. Somewhere behind him, in the black cells that had once held Sansa's father, a new prisoner waited, a Frey messenger, captured mid-flight between two houses that no longer trusted him, carrying in his possession a piece of correspondence that would, in the days to come, reveal exactly how deep House Frey's betrayal had been intended to run, and exactly how many of Tywin Lannister's own careful calculations had been built, from the very beginning, on foundations considerably less stable than the man himself had ever permitted himself to believe. The correspondence found on the captured Frey messenger arrived on Tywin Lannister's desk 4 days after the inconclusive battle at the Twins, and its contents forced upon him the kind of reckoning he had spent an entire career avoiding. The discovery that his own carefully calculated mercy had been, from its very first moment, incomplete in ways that threatened to unmake everything it had been designed to secure. The letter was not from Walder Frey at all, but to him, a communication from Petyr Baelish, dated weeks before the betrayal's execution, laying out in careful, deniable language an arrangement that implicated Littlefinger far more deeply in the Frey treachery than anyone in King's Landing had suspected. Baelish, it emerged, had been playing both sides of the war's outcome for months, cultivating Sansa's trust in King's Landing while simultaneously arranging, through Frey's ambition and his own considerable skill at persuasion, a betrayal designed to prolong the war indefinitely rather than end it. Because a Westeros, locked in endless, grinding conflict between Stark and Lannister, was a Westeros where a clever, landless lord, with control over the Vale's resources, and a young, grateful, and increasingly isolated Stark heiress could rise considerably further than any peace would ever permit him to. Tywin read the letter twice, then a third time, and felt something he had not felt since his own father's disastrous mismanagement of Casterly Rock decades prior. The specific, cold fury of discovering that he had been outmaneuvered by a man he had dismissed as a mere accountant of other men's debts. "He has been managing us both," Tywin said, when he summoned Tyrion and Varys to his solar with the letter still in hand. "The mercy I extended to Stark, the betrayal I accepted from Frey, both, it appears, served Baelish's purposes considerably more than they served mine." Varys, reading the letter in turn with the particular stillness of a man recalculating every assumption he had built across 2 months of careful observation, found in its contents a confirmation of suspicions he had voiced obliquely months before, and never pressed hard enough. "I did warn you, my lord, that Lord Baelish's interests bore watching. You warned me in riddles, as you always do. Tywin's voice carried none of its usual measured control. I require considerably more direct counsel now than riddles, Lord Varys, given how thoroughly your riddles have thus far failed to prevent this. The immediate danger, all three men understood without needing to state it explicitly, was not merely political embarrassment, but something considerably more urgent. Sansa Stark, still within King's Landing's walls, still the object of Littlefinger's 2 months of patient cultivation, represented a piece on the board that Baelish had positioned himself to seize the moment the war's chaos provided sufficient cover. If the letter's implications held true, Littlefinger had not been protecting Sansa Stark from King's Landing's dangers. He had been curating those dangers, carefully, to ensure she trusted no one else enough to resist whatever move he intended to make once circumstances permitted it. Tywin's response was immediate and, for the first time in the entire war, entirely without the careful deliberation that had characterized every prior decision since the Sept of Baelor. He ordered Littlefinger detained, quietly, without public accusation, on the pretext of consultation regarding the realm's finances, and dispatched Sir Kevan personally to secure Sansa Stark's person before whatever contingency Baelish had prepared could be activated in the confusion. They were nearly too late. Littlefinger, whose entire career had been built upon anticipating precisely this kind of exposure long before it arrived, had already set his final arrangement in motion. A ship in Blackwater Bay, crewed by men loyal to coin rather than crown, prepared to carry Sansa Stark out of King's Landing under the pretense of returning her to her family, but bound, in truth, for the Vale, where Lysa Arryn, Littlefinger's oldest and most pliable ally, waited to receive a Stark heiress who would arrive believing herself rescued, and would discover only slowly, if ever, how thoroughly that rescue had been engineered from its very inception. Sansa herself, summoned from her chambers by a servant she had learned to trust as one of Littlefinger's careful arrangements, found herself halfway to the Blackwater docks before the full shape of what was happening began to clarify in her mind, not through any dramatic revelation, but through the accumulated weight of 2 months of small observations she had noticed, without fully processing how every kindness Littlefinger offered arrived precisely when she was most vulnerable to it, how every warning he gave about others' motives never once extended to his own. It was Sandor Clegane, alerted by Sir Kevan's search and moving through the city's backways with the particular ruthless efficiency of a man who had spent his entire life navigating exactly this kind of violence, who intercepted the party before it reached the docks. The confrontation that followed was brief and brutal. The Hound had never possessed Littlefinger's patience for subtlety, and had no intention of acquiring it now, and it ended with Sansa Stark returned, shaking but unharmed, to the Red Keep, and with Petyr Baelish's carefully constructed escape exposed before it could be completed. Tywin's audience with Littlefinger, conducted in the same solar where he had once explained to Cersei the cold logic of trading Ned Stark's life for a strategic pause, was shorter than either man's reputation for careful maneuvering might have suggested it would be. You would have made off with a hostage whose value to this house is considerably more than you understood, Tywin said, and something in his voice carried the particular finality of a man who had already decided the outcome of this conversation before it began. I extended you trust because our interests appeared to align. I find now they never did. Interests always diverge eventually, my lord, Littlefinger said, and even facing what he understood to be a genuine reckoning, something in his composure remained maddeningly, characteristically unbroken. I merely arrived at that divergence somewhat sooner than you anticipated. Tywin did not have him executed. The political cost of eliminating a man with Littlefinger's financial entanglements across half the realm's great houses remained, even now, higher than Tywin's fury was willing to spend. But he had him stripped of every office, every holding, every scrap of influence Littlefinger had spent a lifetime accumulating, and confined to a remote Lannister holding where his considerable talents would find no further opportunity to reshape a war already costly enough without his particular brand of chaos compounding it. It was, Tywin reflected in the solitary hours that followed, the closest thing to a genuine defeat he had suffered since staying Ilyn Payne's blade 2 months prior. Not a battlefield loss, but something more fundamental, proof that his cold arithmetic, however precisely calculated, had never once accounted for a man whose entire strategy depended on exploiting exactly the kind of careful, patient calculation Tywin had built his own reputation upon. Sansa Stark, informed that evening of the full extent of what she had nearly been drawn into, sat for a long while in silence before finally speaking the only judgment she found herself able to offer. "He told me no one else in this city intended to protect me," she said, to Tywin himself, in an audience she had requested rather than been summoned to. The first time in 2 months of captivity, she had sought out the man responsible for her father's survival on her own initiative. "I believed him because everyone else's protection came with a price I could see clearly. His simply hid its price better." Tywin regarded her for a long moment, and something in his expression, not warmth, Tywin Lannister remained incapable of warmth, but something adjacent to a grudging clinical respect, suggested he had not expected a girl of 13 to articulate the war's central lesson more clearly than most of the grown men who had spent months fighting it. "Every protection in this city carries a price, Lady Stark. The only genuine wisdom available to you is learning to recognize which prices you can afford to pay and which will cost you considerably more than you understand at the moment of offering." It was not comfort. Tywin Lannister had none genuine to give, and both of them understood that. But it was, in its own cold way, the truest thing anyone had told Sansa Stark since her father's blade had nearly fallen at the Sept of Baelor 2 months before. And somewhere beyond the Solar's windows, in a war still very much undecided between a Stark heir who trusted no Lannister promise and a Lannister patriarch who had just discovered the limits of his own careful arithmetic, the game continued its grinding, merciless turn toward whatever reckoning still waited to be paid. The peace that finally ended the open war between House Stark and House Lannister was not the peace Tywin had originally calculated for at the Sept of Baelor, nor the marriage he had proposed after the Blackwater, nor any arrangement either side would have recognized as victory in the war's earliest days. It was instead the peace of two houses too exhausted and too thoroughly disillusioned with easy answers to continue a conflict that had cost them Stannis' fleet, Frey's loyalty, Littlefinger's schemes, and nearly Sansa Stark's freedom, in exchange for gains neither side could any longer clearly articulate. Robb Stark rode to King's Landing himself to negotiate the final terms, a decision that cost him considerable argument from bannermen who still favored continued war, but one he insisted upon, having learned, in the months since Frey's betrayal, that peace negotiated at a distance through ravens and proxies was peace built on exactly the kind of misplaced trust that had nearly cost his sister everything. He met Tywin Lannister in the same throne room where his father had once served as hand, and the terms they settled upon reflected the particular, hard-won wisdom both men had acquired across a war neither had fully controlled. The North would retain effective independence in all but name. Its bannermen's grievances addressed through concessions Tywin would once have considered unthinkable, while House Stark formally renounced any further claim against the Iron Throne, not out of submission, but out of a mutual, unspoken recognition that total victory had proven, for both sides, considerably more costly than either had initially calculated. Sansa Stark returned north with her brother, having survived King's Landing's machinery of manipulation, with a clarity about power's true costs that no Septa's lessons could have taught her, carrying with her the particular, permanent education that trust, in the Game of Thrones, was never free, and rarely what it first appeared to be. Tywin Lannister remained in King's Landing, hand to a king he no longer fully trusted, having learned that mercy and cruelty alike carried consequences beyond even his considerable ability to calculate. And somewhere north, past the wall's ancient ice, a cold no-treaty could negotiate, with continued gathering itself in silence, indifferent to every careful arithmetic that had determined who lived and who died in the war just ended. The game had changed hands more than once since that raven first stayed ill in Payne's blade. It was far from finished changing hands again,